Okay, so welcome everyone. Um, my name is Tiffany Dubon Yard. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Student Life Specialist specializing in civic engagement for the Office of Student Life and also co-chair of the Social Justice Network. And on behalf of Student Life and the Social Justice Network, we welcome you to our Bystander Intervention Training session day 2. So I hope I do see some returners from day 1. So welcome back. And for those of you, this is your first time, welcome. Please remain muted during the session unless we ask you to. If the presenters do require any type of feedback, please refer to the chat or use the raised hand feature and they would be able to call on you. If there are any questions that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat. Our presenters will be keeping an eye on the chat and most likely answering questions as they go, but we will definitely have time at the end to answer any and all questions that you may have. Please make sure to keep the chat respectful, and we hope that you're all here with an open mind. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Chanel Boyce, just for some quick introductions between her and Kamisi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. We are so glad to be here, and I'm very excited to be back here for part 2. Today's presentation is going to center around LGBTQ folks, and my co-presenter today is Kamisi Black. Okay, I think, all right, all right. So here's our bios. I'll just say very quickly, I am a mental health therapist by trade. I'm also a nurse, but the most important things for this training is that I am a Black queer person, and I have been a community organized activist consultant for like over a decade at this point. And, you know, I have done so many trainings like this, and really my passion is community education. So I do a lot of anti-racism and intersectional education, and we're just really excited to be here. With that, I'll pass it to Kamisi.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kamisi Black. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a community organizer, activist. I've been organizing for, I don't know, like 12 years, maybe a little bit longer now. I am also an educator, like Chanel. I typically teach and educate folks around origins and intersections of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, a lot of the different structural inequalities that we have. Also a formerly incarcerated person and co-founder of Justice and Unity for Southern Tier, which is a criminal justice organization here in upstate New York.
Okay, so this is always super important, just some ground rules for our space, because we will be talking about just a topic that a lot of times, sometimes people have difficulty with. So a lot of times you'll see presenters will use the word safe space. I don't use that term because I can't really guarantee your safety. I can't guarantee like your emotional safety in this space, because, you know, there's different people with different perspectives and backgrounds. But I will say that I can say this is going to be a responsible space, which means you're going to be responsible for anything that you say here, and you'll be accountable for those things. And we're going to hold each other accountable for the things that we learn here, not just today, but also outside of the space. With that being said, this is going to be a gracious space. And I say this because, you know, the stranger is welcome. For some people here, this is not a new topic, and they are probably well versed on a lot of it. And for other people, this might be still part of their introduction to understanding. So we're going to give people a chance to really, like, you know, dig deep, and we're going to give people grace. The next part is progressive stack. And for folks who are not familiar with progressive stack, what that just means is that for, you know, in the common American society, people who get to like speak the most and who are listened to the most typically are like white, cisgendered, you know, hetero, male, middle-aged men. So basically what we do is like flip that on its head, and it means that the most marginalized people will get to like speak most, take up the most space, meaning that, you know, if there's like a Black trans woman, they're gonna just get priority to speak first over someone else who may in other spaces be prioritized. Just because, you know, it's important that we make sure that we are allowing people who are marginalized to have the room and the space, especially when we're speaking about their lived experiences. The next one is pause, and pause just means a space for like oops, or ouch, because sometimes, you know, you might say something, as soon as you say it, you're like, okay, I should not have said that. So you say oops. And then someone else might say something, you're like, okay, ouch. And that just gives us an opportunity just to hold each other accountable. And as presenters, just to like take a second and hold space and then just do any like necessary correction that we need to do. And the last two are self-explanatory. This is a queer and trans, Black, and POC affirming space. And we just like to say that just to remind people that we are going to center those people in this space. Okay. Does everyone agree to the ground rules? I need people to give you a thumbs up on, or you can say yes or agreed in the chat, because that's very, very important. Now always wait for that, because that's super important, because you want to make sure that you agree to the ground rules. And if anyone takes like issue with the ground rule or wants to add something, that is also okay and completely welcome. Okay, well, I don't hear any objections to the ground rules, so I am going to assume that means, I see a raised hand. I'm not sure if the person actually has a question or if they wanted to just give a thumbs up. Okay, so
I think it was meant for a thumbs up. Yeah.
Okay, meant for a thumbs up. Okay, so like Tiffany said, we will be watching the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat at any point, or raise your hand. We will answer questions intimately throughout this whole presentation. But if for longer questions, of course, we will leave that to the end. And what I usually say, if it's a question you ask and we're going to get to it later on in the presentation, I said, okay, we're going to put that in the parking lot, which just means we're going to get to that later. Okay. So it just helps us keep things moving along. Okay. So today we're going to cover a variety of topics, and that's some of that there. I won't go through them all. It's a lot of topics, but I promise we will get through most of it. Okay, so this is really important. A lot of times when we have these conversations about bystander intervention, people forget why we have a need for bystander intervention. A lot of it is because marginalized histories are like just completely like left out. But we say, like, you know, it is no accident that so few historical records preserve the lives of queer individuals. History does not remember what it does not value. And that's from, you know, best practices for serving LGBTQ students. And if you've never seen that guide, I would highly recommend that you take a look at it, because it has lots of great information, which could help you best serve your students. Okay. All right. And this is by Gabby Amoni Hartman. And I love this quote because for a lot of people, you know, they believe that the terms like gay and transgender, just because those terms are new, that people who are gay, queer, transgender have never existed. But it's false. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. So this quote says, the erroneous idea that we transgender people have no past feeds the notion held by many cisgender people that we don't belong in the present. And we're going to talk a lot to just make sure people understand that there is a very long history of transgender folks. So the records of gender variant people are over 4,000 years old, and that's just what we have today. If you speak to like Native people, they'll say, well, as far back as 12,000 years. Okay. Okay, so these are certain, we'll say there's like lots of hidden histories, and there's, these are some pictures from different cultures. The first one on the left-hand side is the Mahu people from Hawaii. The right-hand side is the Hijra people from India. And on the bottom is indigenous people from America. And we're gonna show just a very quick video which is just gender diversity through time, because I feel like it's very helpful in terms of like really understanding the effects of, I'm sorry, colonialism and the effects of colonialism.
This is Geronimo from the Native American Navajo community in New Mexico.
Francis Geronimo Louis. I am Chiricahua Apache, born for Diné. I identify as a two-spirit individual. This is my backyard. There's a lot of trees, lots of cactus. There's some mountains over there.
Geronimo identifies as one of the 4 sacred and ancient gender identities from his culture.
We have masculine, 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 feminine, 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 masculine. Masculine feminine is something that I gravitate towards both spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally. The word for masculine feminine is nakle, someone who is male-bodied, has a feminine nature, or who also takes on the roles of a woman and man. I take it quite literally sometimes. I can dress as a female, I can dress as a male. And traditionally, you're supposed to tie up your hair in its ears. So men's traditionally would be right here, and women's traditionally would be somewhere up here. We wear bandanas. I know that I'm a male, and I can take on the gender roles of a female. I weave, I cook, I clean.
8,000 miles away in India's capital, Delhi, gender has been more than just male and female for centuries.
Hi, Namaste. I'm Leher. I'm 23 and I was not born in a female body.
In 2014, the Supreme Court recognized a 3rd gender.
I was assigned sex male at birth and I changed my gender medically. However, I'm not what in the Western terminologies you would call a trans woman or a transgender. In India, we're considered 3rd gender or the sacred gender that has the power to bless or to curse. They're regarded as highly sacred and respectable. Gender has never been binary in India. It's always been very, very fluid, especially in Indian mythologies. We have scriptures that describe more than 20 to 28 genders. We have story of Shikhandi. Shikhandi was assigned female at birth. However, the person transformed themselves into a man to fight the Battle of Mahabharata.
Over in Australia, transgender people have had different names among Aboriginal communities. Kai identifies as a brother boy.
So a brother boy is a person that's been born female, but has a male spirit or masculine spirit. Our understanding of being is so much more than a scientific definition of what is XX chromosome or XY chromosome. We can coexist, but doesn't mean that you should perpetrate hate and violence onto people that don't necessarily believe in the way that you believe.
However, Kai's journey hasn't been easy, as he still faces discrimination in his own community.
As someone that was born a woman and done women's stuff, and then transitioning into a man, you know, it's quite difficult at times to find your place as a person within my culture. And I think, yeah, I'm still on that journey.
And for many communities, the history of gender fluidity was lost with colonialism.
Sister girls and brother boys history is difficult to document because of the effect of colonization. There's been a lot of shame and stigma.
Pre-colonialism time, gender roles were actually widely accepted amongst my people and our tribe. These individuals who were called two-spirit were widely respected when colonialism started to happen. A lot of our people died and were murdered, and so a lot of the teachings and understandings of these people were lost. Forced assimilation, religious conversion all contributed to the idea that two-spirit individuals were bad people and they needed to go away. I think.
Okay, so I show that video because a lot of times, you know, there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of like just like where did transgender people come from, or that, you know, it's just something that has just currently just become trendy, and that this is not something that has, you know, been in existence through multiple cultures. But we have to realize that the reason why we don't necessarily have an understanding, or we don't have a lot of documented history about gender variance or gender diversity, or even just LGBTQ people in general, is because of colonization, because they have been through all cultures throughout time and history. Okay, and another very cool thing that I love to show is this map that I came across a few years ago, because someone made this map to illustrate the very thing that we're discussing. And you'll see that basically it's a Google map, and they have documented all the different kinds of, you know, just the different names of, you know, gender diverse people and cultures throughout, you know, the world. And obviously it's not an exhaustive list, but there are, you know, lots of different ones. And, you know, I will share this presentation with Tiffany. So if people want to take a look at them, because it's lots of different ones throughout South Asia. There's Peru, Kenya, Tanzania, Italy, Siberia, and the list goes on and on and on about just, you know, very diverse people. And even in like countries like Iran, where, you know, gay marriage is not, you know, legalized and is actually illegal, they do have an allowance for people who are transgender, and they are allowed to live as the other gender. So even in countries that we wouldn't think that there has been, you know, the existence and the acceptance of transgender and gender diverse folks, it has existed that way and has been that way for centuries. Okay, so. Okay. So everybody with me so far? I haven't been able to check the chat. Okay. Okay, so a lot of people and folks are familiar with Stonewall, and lots of times people think that a lot of people think that, you know, LGBTQ movement started with Stonewall. And we're going to talk a little bit about Stonewall, but there is a, you know, a long history, honestly, that starts before Stonewall. And at a little point later, I'm going to show you all a timeline about just different LGBTQ moments and important moments in history. So there's just this first video. It's very short, but it's by Billy Porter is the one that narrates it. So it's actually a pretty great video. And for some reason, there we go.
You're familiar with Stonewall, of course, but what about the activist movements throughout history that haven't received as much attention? Let's take a look at some of the more obscure political actions that have also changed the course of queer history. A brief history of overlooked queer political actions, narrated by Billy Porter, illustrated by Amit Greenberg. 1920s, the Society for Human Rights. When U.S. Army soldier Henry Gerber was stationed in Germany from 1920 to 1923, he saw the rise of homophile organizations, as gay rights groups were once called. Upon returning to Chicago in 1924, Gerber founded the Society for Human Rights, the first gay rights organization in America, which also produced the country's first gay rights newsletter called Freedom and Friendship. Shortly after the newsletter was disseminated, Gerber's home was raided by the police. He was arrested, his papers confiscated, he lost his job and life savings. The society fell apart. Later, Gerber relocated to New York City and began writing activist works again, this time under the pen name Parasex. He continued his activism until his death in the 1970s. The Mattachine Society was formed in the early 1950s by Harry Hay. It started in California, but quickly spread across the country, providing a space for gays and lesbians to gather and discuss their experiences. This was radical at a time when few Americans were out. In some places, it was illegal for homosexuals to gather at all. The organization declared homosexuals were an oppressed minority, that developing a community was essential to overcoming oppression, and that anti-gay legislation in the US needed to be overturned. However, in 1953, the group's radical ideas were traded for more accommodationist ones, which stated that homosexuals should adapt to, not combat, heterosexual lifestyles in order to obtain equality.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The Mattachines dissolved at the end of the 1960s when gay rights activism became more aggressive. The Daughters of Politis was formed in 1955 in San Francisco by Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin. It was named after poet Pierre Louis's The Songs of Bilitis, in which Bilitis was said to be a female lover of Greek poet Sappho. It was one of the first lesbian organizations ever established in the US. Originally assembled as a meeting place for lesbians, the group also held public forums to teach people about homosexuality and provided support to partnered, single, and parenting lesbians. The Daughters of Bilitis shut down in the early 1970s, but is known for its commitment to fostering understanding in and out of the lesbian community. The riot at Gene Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood happened in August 1966. A policeman grabbed the drag queen in an attempt to arrest her, and she threw a cup of coffee in his face. A riot began almost immediately, with glass windows smashed by thrown sugar shakers, tables flipped, and cutlery thrown. These particular Compton's customers had had enough. Cops had been arresting drag queens, gay hustlers, and transgender women at the 24-hour eatery regularly for cross-dressing, for obstructing the sidewalk, or for any reason they could find to throw them in jail. After the incident, the diner banned trans women, and the Tenderloin's largely queer community rebelled, picketing the establishment and breaking its new windows. The Compton's riots received no coverage at all in any of San Francisco's publications, but today is recognized for its importance as one of the first queer uprisings against police brutality. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence first emerged in 1979 when 4 gay men, bored with the sameness of San Francisco's Castro district, put on retired nuns' habits. Realizing their presence could bring joy and initiate social change, they draw attention to queer discrimination and religious hypocrisy, promote safe sex, and educate against the dangerous effects of drug use, all the while raising money for AIDS, LGBTQ+, and community-related causes. Chapters have since expanded across the globe. Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, was organized by queer historical icons and self-described drag queens Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Both had been present at Stonewall and active in the Gay Liberation Front, and decided to organize homeless trans youth, drag queens, sex workers, immigrants, and low-income people in New York. Rivera and Johnson were homeless themselves and saw STAR as a way to help provide shelter for the people they knew as their children. They bought a building, fixed it up, provided shelter and clothes for people who came through. STAR grew from New York to Chicago, California, and even England, and lasted approximately 3 years before it shut down. While the riots at Stonewall are, of course, important, their story starts decades before and continues today. Thanks to people like Henry Gerber, Phyllis Lyon, Sylvia Rivera, Larry Kramer, and countless others, queer activism still has a loud and forceful voice in and out of the community. We owe so much to their legacy. We continue to speak out in honor of the strides they made for us and the lives we hope to change in the future.
Right, and we show these, these videos because I know, and I didn't realize how video heavy the beginning of it was, but I promised, I think there's like 2 more videos in the 2 hours and that's it. But it's really important. I think it's, good to hear from the people themselves in terms of like their own cultural histories and identities, because that's directly who it's affecting. And, I like firmly believe that, when we have in these conversations, we should hear from those who are directly impacted, and we should highlight their experiences. So, and I think the thing that I forgot to say on the last slide that I really do want to bring up is that even though, terms like transgender and like gay and lesbian, those terms are new. The concepts and ideologies are not new. We have to remember those things. And that for a lot of cultures, you know, there more than two genders have always existed, and that this very binary concept is a really Western ideology that a lot of other cultures don't subscribe to. And you saw like in that last video, where the woman from India said that she's not a trans woman and that she does not identify as transgender. I think that's a very important concept for people to really, you know, hold on to. And she even said there was as many as 28 different genders in her culture. Okay, so, and then this one is about Stonewall. And not cooperating.
In front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, a riot broke out in front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The violent protest became known as the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States. We'll look at the roots of the riots, the events, and their lasting impact. In the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was still considered sodomy and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community were often subject to violence, harassment, and discrimination. In New York City, gay bars were havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. The Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia. The Mafia bribed the police to look the other way. In turn, the Mafia made money overcharging patrons for drinks. Even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort wealthy patrons, threatening to out them to their employers and families. Despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people were also targeted, subjected to violence, and arrested if they weren't wearing what the police deemed gender-appropriate clothing. This oppression and mistreatment came to a head in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. 9 police officers entered the Stonewall Inn in a raid. The patrons were fed up. As the police roughly tried to arrest bartenders and customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people in the hundreds began rioting. They threw bottles at police and pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd and locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown into thousands. Eventually, the police were able to get the crowd to disperse, but it didn't last long. The riots continued until July 1st. While some criticized the violent and destructive riots, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall Riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to others marginalized for their sexual or gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, Pride events are still held on the anniversary of the Stonewall Riots in cities around the country and even the world. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn and the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall Riots may have been violent, but they marked a pivotal moment in history. No longer would people quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientations. Through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility and a momentum that continues to this day.
Okay, so, Stonewall is what I like to say is, the beginning of the modern LGBTQ movement. And it's really important. I think the first video we watched talked about the Compton riots, which was like, what people kind of document as like one of the first, instances of trans, activism against like police brutality. And the interesting thing about this, which is very different from what happened at Stonewall, even though it happened like, I believe 3 years prior in 1966, the Compton riots received like zero news coverage in San Francisco, so much to the fact to the day that we have no idea exactly what day that the Compton riots actually happened, because there was a complete news blackout around the event. But the community was so impacted by it. And I mean, they had smashed all the windows and they had replaced them, and the community chose to like smash the windows completely again. And they chose furthermore not to continue to patronize the business. And eventually the business shuttered because that was the community chose not to support it. And so yeah, Kamisi, want to say something?
Oh,
Okay.
I just said that's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so, people do have power. And I think that's really important thing is that, you can choose to like not patronize businesses who, are transphobic, and that there's a long history of it. And for the Stonewall, you'll see lots of people like will interchangeably use the words, uprising and riots. And I like to mention this because there's a lot of negative connotations around riots. And I know this conversation has come up for us so many times, especially in recent history with the uprisings of like last summer. But I think people are most familiar with, Dr. King's quote, a riot is like the language of the unheard. So I believe that there has been a reclamation of like the word riots. And a lot of people, don't condone violence. And even, Dr. King, who is, the most, I think, pacifistic person we know in history, especially at that time when he gave that particular speech in 66, is just understanding that even if you are a pacifist, the other people, have their own ways of, demonstrating just their frustration with not being heard. And that, at some point, and that's why I put it as like the match that sparked the movement, because people will get frustrated and choose, that there's different points and there's diversity of tactics in revolution. Okay, and post nightclub. Okay, and I put this like purposely right after because I think at the end of the Stonewall video, it talks about how Obama, in 2016, he, made a national monument. But if anyone looks at the dates, it was literally right after post nightclub. So a lot of people in the community think that making Stonewall Monument was like it was a direct, answer to the post nightclub. And if people are not familiar with post nightclub, it happened in June of 2016. And it is like considered one of the most deadliest like mass shootings by a single gunman in US history. And not only was it a targeted attack against LGBTQ people, but it was also against, people of color as well, because it was during their Latin night. So most of the victims were actually Latino. So it's one of the deadliest, terrorist attacks in the US since September 11th. A lot of times we don't like to use like words like terrorists and, attacks when it's, homegrown, like American people but we have to call it what it is. And I feel like that's, very important. And so, as you can see, that was only just a few years ago. So we're still, facing, these violent outbursts of discrimination, because this was obviously a hate crime. And he was only a 29-year-old man, and he wrote it was a whole manifesto about his hatred of LGBTQ people in the name of the Islamic State.
And really just to add as well, the person who did the shooting, right, was the environment for someone to be able to create like that level of harm against the LGBTQ community is reinforced by society in general, right? This cis heteronormative patriarchy that we live in permeates every aspect of society. So, essentially, his actions have been validated by decades, if not centuries, of stigma against our community that has been allowed to exist with complicity.
Okay, and the next one is just a long timeline, but the ones that I really want to highlight is like the first one. So in April 1952, the American Psychiatric Association, which the APA is still in existence today, listed homosexual under a sociopathic personality disorder. So personality disorders on their own holds a lot of stigma. But if we add, when we call someone a sociopath, that I think that's one of the worst, things we can call someone. So to, to compare and to label homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disorder, it just shows like the level of discrimination and how insidious the hatred of people, of LGBTQ people was at that time, and how much it was just pathologized. Okay, and then, so subsequently after that, and a lot of times, things like that just make room for like laws. Okay, there's this ideology that's happening, in mental health in the psychiatric world, which is then further like legitimized by law, which is, President Eisenhower the next year goes on to say, to issue an executive order and say that gay men and women cannot serve in the government because it's a security risk, which is legitimized by the fact that the APA says that they're sociopaths. And I just say that because it just shows that, it's so important that no matter what field you are in, is that, we are in positions of power and so on and so forth. And they said that back in 1952, and they didn't correct that until 1973. So that was over 20 years they took to even, say that homosexuality was not actually a mental disorder. Okay, so there's lots of other things here. And, that, also goes with like, the whole don't ask, don't tell policy. And, same-sex, marriage was not legalized nationwide until 2015. And even so, that was by a very small margin, because the Supreme Court legalized it by just 5-4. So it could have not passed. Okay. So, and we gave a lot of background in terms of like LGBTQ history so that folks can understand just like exactly why they have to be a bystander. So we're going to keep going through that. Throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most, that has made it possible for evil to triumph. And this is by Haile Selassie. And probably a quote that folks are more familiar with is by MLK, when it talks about, the moderate, the silent moderate, the white moderate that, well-meaning white folks, the ones that are not the KKK, and just those that just are so complicit by just like saying nothing. And that's exactly what bystander intervention seeks to address and to change. So what is a bystander? Okay, yes, and someone says the whole DSM is basura. It's garbage, yes. And as a mental health therapist who was forced to use the DSM, because you can't get paid without it, I wholeheartedly agree. But that's another workshop in terms of why, it's white supremacy and colonialism is completely indoctrinated into the DSM. Okay, so basically, what is a bystander? It's anyone in the community who witnesses or is aware of a behavior that could lead to harm. And that's a very simplistic definition, but it's really important that we think about who's a bystander. And because I think we think about a bystander as someone who sees something that's happening that's like harm, but a lot of times we don't think about the other person who just might hear about something that doesn't sit right, or hear about someone that's like in a bad situation, or it's in a situation that's like DV, and chooses to do nothing about it. That person is also complicit, because we have to think about this as, a community responsibility. Okay, what is harm? And this is a question that we're going to answer many and many times over during this presentation, because we have to have a good grasp of what harm is if we're going to be able to actually intervene. And I think that a lot of times this is where people kind of get tripped up, because they don't have the ability to recognize what is harm. And this is, I say harm is differentiates between bystander intervention and like neighborhood watch. So a lot of time in like neighborhood watch programs, it's like heavily perceived and based within like bias. So we think about like, Trayvon Martin, and so lots of like biases, like it's not actually harm, it's the perception that someone may be harmful, may be dangerous, but we don't actually see or witness or are aware of any harm actually being committed. But that's really what is happening there, is like vigilantism. Okay, so where did bystander intervention start? So this was the case of Kitty Genovese. So in Queens, New York in 1964, Kitty Genovese, she was stalked and stabbed outside of her apartment. And they believe that there was as many as 38 individuals either saw or heard the attack, and no one did anything to help her. So she died. And this became a national story because people believe that if even one person would have intervened by like trying to like either directly intervene or call the police or anything like that, that maybe the outcome could have been different for her. So this became a national story, and it prompted social scientists to start actually researching the bystander effect. And I think someone has their hand raised. I think it's Monique. You have a question?
Yes, Chanel. So I'm a social psychologist. Kitty Genovese is my joint. This is the story that we've been telling for a long time. Theorists like DeLay and Latany have been talking about this. Bill Genovese did a documentary about his sister a couple of years ago called The Witness, and he refuted the notion that her neighbors stood by and watched. A lot of them were undocumented, a lot of them were afraid, but people did try to come out and help her. Everything that you're saying about bystander apathy is correct, but I think like a lot of updating needs to be done on the Kitty Genovese story. I wouldn't be myself if I didn't say that. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. But you said that's The Witness. The Witness is where.
Yeah, that's the documentary that her little brother produced.
Right. Okay. So I will look into that, but this is the first time I'm hearing that. And I think this version of events is well documented throughout many different research studies. But given what you said about people being undocumented and things like that, and we do talk about that in a later slide in terms of what might prevent someone or give someone pause from like intervening in a situation, and immigration status is certainly one of them. So I could see how that could be true. Okay, so and this was mentioned in the last slide, but basically the bystander effect, it just says that individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present. And the more people that are present, the less likely they are to intervene. Okay, So what impacts the likelihood of a bystander intervening? And the first one is ability to recognize harm. So you actually have to be aware that there is a problem and then recognize the negative impact on the victim before you could even think about the fact that you should intervene. And the next is being asked. A lot of times, if we're specifically asked like for help, then you're far more likely to intervene than when you're not asked. And people who witness like pro-social interventions are more likely to effectively intervene in the future. So, and I've witnessed this many times. So folks who, and most in my situation and most, like my experience is most often in terms of like dealing with police, when people have been with me and seen me like stop and, you know, do what I do to intervene in those kind of situations, they have said they feel comfortable because they have seen me do it. So now they know exactly what to do and they see that it's not as scary. And I feel like they could be actually more effective and intervene in the future. And then group size, which we did talk about before. And I think the thing about group size is that a lot of times, because of this whole idea of like personal responsibility that like exists within American culture, is that people think that someone else is going to be the person to intervene, and that it just keeps getting passed off to the next person. The bigger the group is, someone's going to believe, okay, if they see a crime being a crime happening or something being, that someone else intervened, someone else called the cops, or someone else called that little girl's mom who's outside too late. Someone else must have done something about this already. So I can't be the only, I know I'm not the only person who saw this happen. Okay. All right. Okay, so a slight trigger warning for this video in terms there is some groping in it. But this was a study that was done at Cornell University. Let's see one more. Maybe after. That was done at Cornell University. And it was found to be pretty successful. So we'll just do 2 minutes of this video.
The sound is super low.
Yeah.
Can't hear the conversation. Oh, there you go.
How's it going? Yeah, I'm having a really good time. This is Corey. He's in my study group. We're good. Hey. I'm gonna get you some water. Hey guys, look at Rachel. She's wasted. I don't think she knows what she's doing. She looks blackout right now.
Yeah, I saw them doing shots earlier.
Maybe she wants to hook up with him. I've heard her mention him before.
He's cute.
Maybe she does, but she's too drunk to know what's going on.
I think he knows it.
Why don't we take her to the bathroom?
You should distract him. Mom?
Let me try something. Come to the bathroom with us.
You join our team, bro.
Okay, so what they found in the 4-week follow-up study was that survey is that students who watched just the video alone, it's a 20-minute video, I just showed you all a clip, is that they reported that they were much more likely to intervene for most situations compared to a control group who did not watch the video. And that the other bonus side effect that they noticed that there was just an overall reduction in campus incidents of sexual assault and violence. guess I'll go back to presenter mode. Okay, so a few years ago, we did a online poll before we were doing this workshop, just asked people what was most likely to prevent them from intervening during an emergency, an incident, or a police situation. And most people said that it was the fear of making the situation worse, followed by the fear of like bodily harm, which also was tied with they just don't know what to do, which is why we chose to like create a bystander intervention workshop, and then also to address and just give people general information on what to do in those situations, so they don't feel like they're going to make the situation worse or that they're going to get hurt. All right, and I'm gonna pass it to Kamisi so I can stop talking for a little bit.
Yes, and doubling back to the slide that you were just talking about real quick, when you look at like bigger like sample groups, compared to just the online data, this is essentially the same trend that you see, that most people are afraid to try to intervene out of fear of making the situation worse. When compared to like, polls from people who actually needed bystander, intervention, whether they were experiencing, harassment of any sort or violence, the overwhelming majority of people wanted someone to intervene in situations that it didn't happen. So, just to try to, help relieve, that fear of making the situation worse, and it very rarely will you find yourself in a situation where intervening actually makes the situation worse for the victim of the harassment as well as yourself. But next slide.
Right, and the sample size for this was 344 people. So it was a pretty good sample size for this, who actually responded to this poll.
Amazing. One more. Yeah. So why do we need to intervene? Because in some of the examples that Chanel had presented before, when we don't intervene, when even one person doesn't directly confront a situation, the chance for an increased level of harm or violence is very much there. When we look at this year, which is not over yet, 2021 has actually surpassed last year as the deadliest on record for anti-trans violence. Almost 400 people globally who identify as trans and queer were murdered, and at least 50 that we know of in the United States. And I always want to stress that we know of, because so many of these cases go undocumented, unreported, and a lot of states still have these like laws on the books that justify people being murdered from what they call like gay panic, which is something we can hit. Next, please. Keep it moving. Yes. So when we look at the actual statistics of people who are harassed and victimized, trans people and queer folks are victimized at over 4 times the rate of their cis counterparts, and between 3.5 and 5.5 more times to be victimized violently. And when we talk about, I'm sorry, there we go. This harm comes in a lot of different forms. It's not necessarily, someone street harassing. 30 to 50% of all trans people experience some form of intimate partner violence at some point in their life, and many of them identified, some of this abusive behavior as, happening in public places where folks could potentially try to intervene in the situation. And so where does this harassment happen? when we look at the actual data, LGBTQ people in general, not just trans and queer folks, are 6 times more likely to experience violence by someone who is well known to them, and 2.5 times more likely to undergo it at hands of a stranger compared to non-LGBTQIA people. Most of that interaction, again, happening in some form of public space, whether that's at work, where 70% of LGBTQ folks, including myself, have had some form of sexual harassment at work, or LGBTQ related harassment. On public transportation, this is especially big in New York City, right? When we're talking about like the trains and the buses, 41% of people experienced some form of harassing language, whether that was directed towards them or in a less confrontational manner, having 2 people or a group of people commenting about your appearance, speculating on your gender, what have you. Another 26% being subjected to sexual harassment, sexual comments, and of course there's stalking and unfortunately indecent exposure as well. All of these happening at statistically much higher rates than cis folks. Yes. Transphobic language 101. And I really appreciate Chanel actually, adding this to the presentation, because not only do these questions and phrases not belong in your vocabulary, no one should be saying these things, but it's important to know what is causing harm, right? If you hear or see these things being said, you can almost guarantee that some form of intervention is necessary. So there is a trigger warning for folks, because this language is really problematic for sure. While in the queer trans community, there is some form of kind of taking this word back, which is not like a huge thing, but whether or not someone self-identifies themselves with that word, using it is still extremely offensive. And so, please, at all costs, avoid, using this word. And unfortunately, we still see it, very prevalent within the dominant language in society. And moving
especially
to
social media.
Yes, exactly, Chanel. One of the other things is that questioning as to whether or not a person looks according to you, right, like the gender that they're trying to express. When we actually think about this and take apart this idea, gender is a construct, right, and it's a relatively new construct. So what exactly does it mean to look like a man or a woman, right? There's no set criteria, and it should never be assumed that any person that identifies as a trans man or a trans woman is striving to identify with what society has deemed to be the appropriate expression of that gender. Not all trans women want to be feminine, and not all trans men want to look like men. So we really need to kind of erase that idea from our minds. Gender presentation is fluid, and it's distinct from gender identity. And all forms of gender expression deserve affirmation. Another is this idea of why would you transition if you're going to be gay? I hear this one constantly, and it's this idea of equating what your sexual orientation and what your gender expression are, and they are 2 wholly and entirely different things, and make up very different aspects of a person's identity. And so this question really demonstrates how heterosexuality is more valued in our society, and reinforces these ideas and constructs of homophobia and heterosexism. Hitting the next slide, please, Chanel. Continuing, using the wrong pronouns and making assumptions about others' gender identities. It's always important, and even once you're able to make like direct contact with a person who's being, victimized, whether it's during like the direct phase of an intervention or in the delay phase when you're, checking in on them, to make sure that you're asking, not just assuming what you think that person's gender or gender identity is. Asking what their names are, especially in situations where you might have known a person, and there's any possibility of even like dead naming them, right? Because they're already in a situation that is causing harm, most likely because of their gender expression. So to kind of reinforce that victimization only increases harm in these situations. So always ask, what are your pronouns? What can I call you? In terms of names, right? Moving to the next point. Yes, thank you. Asking about a trans person identity or offering information about somebody. Asking someone about another person's identity is also inappropriate. You have no idea if they know what's up or not. And it's still like just really kind of extends this idea of assuming that other people know, who this person is, or assuming, their gender identities without actually just talking to us, right? Yes, what are you really? Have you had surgery? If not, you're really a such and such. I really cannot stand this one as well. Again, and it ties to this idea that our bodies do not have to present what societies, especially a cis heteronormative patriarchal societies, ideas of what genders are supposed to look like physically. So asking about top surgeries, bottom surgeries, are you going to get facial feminization, or masculine affirming like facial surgeries because you still look like such and such, or whatever, is so highly inappropriate and reinforces these ideas that we're not who we think that we are. A lot of us have had so much trauma around gender dysphoria, that comments and conversations like this, tend to lead to increased suicidal ideation, self-harm. So I really cannot hammer enough why these are so highly inappropriate. And moving to the next slide.
Yeah, this from the, yes, reiterating from the chat, use people's names,
thank you.
ask what their pronouns are. And I think that should just be normalized. Ask what people's pronouns are. Like, what's your name? What are your pronouns? It should just be a part of like normal language now at this point.
Exactly. And when we're talking about pronouns, to just say straight up, what are your pronouns, not your preferred pronouns. Again, this idea of preferred, removes our identity from who we actually are. It's a more passive aggressive way of saying, I don't think that you are whatever gender you say you are, if you're using the term preferred, then chances are, you have your own idea of what gender that person is. Saying someone was born a
Well, I want to add
boy. Oh,
something
I'm sorry.
to
Go
that.
ahead.
Okay, just to add something here, because I get a lot of pushback with this one. But I like to say for this one is that we have to remember that language evolves like constantly. And just how, at some point, just how we use the word, at some point in history, homosexual was offensive because of the connotation with the APA, and then it changed, and that's common language. At another point in history, using the word transsexual was normed. And at this point now, we do not use that word whatsoever. So even though, when a lot of folks were first being educated, people were using preferred pronoun, it has since been revised, and we no longer say preferred pronoun. So yes, that's why you have to continuously be educating yourself, because language does evolve.
That's right. Thank you for bringing that point. And that might have even been something that was like mentioned yesterday with folks in like the Black Indigenous, like people of color, like communities, that terms are always and constantly evolving, but it's not hard to adapt to them. But yes, so saying that someone was born a boy or a girl, currently I've never been a boy, right? I was very much born who I am, and because of, again, living in the society that we live in, right, had to try to like relearn and like try to adapt myself to be, considered like normal in society, and realized, how woefully wrong I was, trying to be forced into this identity that I wasn't. And when you talk to most, and everyone has like their own story, their own journey, in terms of how they've uh, reached or found their identities. But to assume that someone was born a certain way and then is now transitioning into something else, again, invalidates these experiences and journeys that we're actually on. There are terms like assigned, like AMAB or AFAB, assigned male or assigned female at birth, which I think is in the right step, in terms of at least acknowledging that someone else had assigned this sex marker, as opposed to allowing the person to make that decision for themselves. But I tend to try to just avoid that language altogether. Using he or she as a catch-all, removes everyone who's in between those binaries. Right. Gender is a spectrum. And when we're talking about gender fluidity, non-binary folks, trans folks, a lot of people don't fit into that, this like binary system that we've tried to construct in our language. And really, he and or she, when I hear that phrase, I always think that that person had almost just like that they had intended to say he, and then forgot that women exist and say she, but still, ignoring this binary, or this non-binary system that gender actually is. And again, reinforcing this idea that people need to look a certain way in order to be genuinely who they say that they are. Saying that someone is female-bodied or male-bodied, there's that doesn't exist. Many people who are trans decide to keep their facial hair or body hair, or not medically transition at all, right? Because they are entirely comfortable in the bodies that they're in, as they should be. And some people have the dysphoria that kind of forces them to make other decisions. But we should never assume that because someone looks a certain way or has a certain or particular type of body, that's ultimately how they're choosing to express their gender. Chanel, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I was also going to say that for a lot of folks, it's also a privilege that not everyone has to be able to like actually medically transition. And so we have to be, cognizant of that as well. Okay, so. All right, so this is just some things to know. We talked a lot about transphobic language, but there's a lot of homophobic language that still, exists within, dominant society. And it just includes any jokes or banter that is negative or disrespectful, or that just perpetuates any kinds of, stereotypes about, LGBTQ people. And the biggest ones, that we hear, especially we hear them from like even, grade school children, like, that's so gay, or you're so gay. And then the big one, I think if you're from the city, you hear like no homo and pause. And Kamisi, as we were talking earlier, was like, you're from the Bronx, I say, hey, yo, when someone says something like that, and just think, so challenging all those kinds of things. And you hear these phrases, I think, from growing up. And then sometimes like we forget to like update our language and realize that though that language comes from a very homophobic place. And a lot of times when we say things like that, we're not really, referring to anything that actually has any kind of connotation that actually points to someone's sexuality. It's more about, something that we think that is not cool, something that's not socially acceptable. And it further reinforces this idea that, people who are, LGBTQ are just not desirable. So we have to just make sure that, you're pointing out these things and you remember that it is harmful, and that especially if we're looking at LGBTQ youth and the rates of suicidal ideation and just of suicide, and they have just, been increasing steadily year to year. And that just also includes, biphobic language. And I think that most commonly what we hear when it comes to bisexual people is just that, that they're greedy and they just, want their whole, pick, they don't want to pick, or that they're just going through a phrase or a phase where they can't make up their mind. And all of that is like incredibly, biphobic, and it invalidates their sexuality. And we really want to just stay away from that kind of language. Okay, so there's levels to this. I think a lot of times, we talk a lot about homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, all these things. And there's a big part in terms of about like internalized transphobia. And this is just, as we live in this society, we internalize these different like societal like norms and values, even if they're at odds with our own identity. So because even though we experience like stigmatization or whatever it is, or discrimination, it doesn't mean that we don't internalize those gender attitudes and then develop, but that also does lead to like development of like negative health outcomes. And like this applies to other people, other LGBTQ people and marginalized folks who experience oppression. So internalized racism, internalized homophobia, internalized ableism, fat phobia, so on and so forth. One thing I always will say be careful of is that if you're not a member of that community, it's not your job to correct their language or challenge their perspective, and that we do that intracommunally, because you have to understand for a lot of people, especially LGBTQ community, there's a lot of trauma that is associated, and even more so for a lot of times for like people of color, that is really cultural, that needs to be unpacked. And it may not be as simple as just like challenging their perspective. And a lot of times, it's best when it's done by a peer who actually understands more intimately their experience. Did you want to add anything, Kamisi?
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Yeah, and everything ties back, as to why we intervene, to this idea that we keep us safe. We cannot rely on structures or systems or institutions, the criminal justice system, any of these things to keep our communities safe. When one person is harmed, we're all harmed. Racism is a system of exploitation that allows both Black and white folks to be exploited for their wages, right? Gender discrimination, this is something that affects everybody. So when harm is being perpetuated against one person in our community, that essentially, just sends these waves, these ripples throughout, the rest of our community, that says that it's okay for this behavior to happen. And it's only a matter of time before it will affect you personally as well, right? This idea that we touched on earlier, that there's no such thing as non-participation, right? Just passive complicity. If you see harm being, being caused, or see violence happening, and choose not to do anything, because there's generally at least something that you can do in a situation to try to help the people who are being targeted, you're giving the okay for the perpetrator to inflict the harm that they're causing. So this idea that you're not involved once you become a bystander is completely false. And something that we had talked about, or Chanel had pointed to earlier, this idea that the larger the group is, the less likely people are to actually intervene in a situation, really needs to get flipped on its head, right? This idea that people like Fred Hampton talk about, where there's people, there is power, right? When you even when you're trying to use like a direct language to say that something's not okay, saying that we think that this is not okay if there are multiple people around, empowers people and gives us, like, reminds, the people who are inflicting this harm that they are in the minority in this situation. Right. There's when you have a group of people, even if it's just like you and a couple friends, right, you have the ability to take the narrative away from them, and empower both the victim, the person who's being harmed, as well as the rest of your community and yourselves, right? And so we do have a responsibility to keep us safe if we want to build this community the way that we want the community to look like. If we want to have a truly safe community, and the spaces where people who exist at these multiple intersections of oppression aren't just tolerated or accepted, but are actually able to thrive, that means creating a community in which everybody can thrive. And so it's all of our responsibilities to make sure that that happens.
So there's a lot of, possible situations in which you might need to actually intervene. There's a list of them, some of them there. I think we've, talked about quite a few of them: cyberbullying, dating or domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, harassment, microaggressions. And we're moving away from like using this term microaggressions, because I think that what most of the research has shown, even though we use the term microaggressions, that the impact of microaggressions is not small. But that's still common language. That's still a dominant language when we talk about those things. Hate crimes, police violence, young children outside or late or unattended, and then homeless folks, unhoused folks in severe weather. I need to change that. Okay, so there's a lot of silent situations. So an individual who never witnesses, participates, or hears about the violence firsthand, but they know that it's impacting those in their community and they choose to do nothing. And that's what we want to move far away from. Like, if we know that something is happening, then we have to believe that it's our responsibility to do something about it. And until we actually take that responsibility, then nothing's going to change. And in order, if we want to have a different idea about what it means to have community, then we have to do something that we've never done before. Okay. So how will I know if I should intervene? I think this is a big one. And I always say you won't. But we give you lots of guidelines around like what kind of situations you may need to intervene in. But these are the things that you should keep in mind. Take a second look and ask the person, like ask them if they're okay. And then the thing you want to think about is like, if this was me or someone that I love or I care about, would I want someone else to intervene in? Because I think I pointed this out earlier. A lot of time when people are in situations that actually require intervention, most often they don't ask for help. So don't look for that to be the thing that, prompts you to intervene. Okay. So there are different like barriers to intervention. I think that this like exists on like different planes. And I think I started to like kind of mention this before. And this came like obviously from the poll, we got a few of them. And people said their personal, barriers to intervention was like fear. They were afraid that they would make the situation worse. They were afraid that that they might be caused some kind of bodily harm, or they didn't know what they were afraid because they didn't know what to do, or they just were vulnerable in the situation. Then the next level of a barrier is like relationship. And I see this like most often with people in a lot of different like communities, is because they like, okay, I know this person really well. I'm in community with this person. This person is my coworker. This person is my friend or my family member. And there may be consequences to me speaking up. I don't want to lose that relationship with that person. So I'm not going to say anything. But I think that we have to like think about it. We have to reframe the conversation when it comes to like relationships with people, and choosing whether or not to intervene, is that we can leverage that relationship with that person for a more positive like effect, and use the fact that we know that person to more safely intervene in the situation. So don't let your relationship with that person be a barrier, but you can use that as actually a way to like more safely intervene. Okay, and the last one is more general and cultural. And a lot of times people are not exactly sure what they're witnessing, which is why, we do such kind of a deep dive into like what harm is, and like understanding like culturally what it means to like, in terms of different identities, what it means to like be witnessing harm. So that's really important. And sometimes it's just important to acknowledge that there might be a cultural gap, which is why it's important to ask the person if they're okay and if they need help. And sometimes, you might think that if you have a different kind of intersection, like if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, so on and so forth, you might think that you won't be believed. But I think it's really important to push past those things and figure out how you can intervene and do so safely. Okay, so consider your privilege. And there's lots of different ones, and I kind of mentioned like the last one a little bit earlier, is that sometimes people choose not to intervene because of one of these different, because they have less privilege. If you have more privilege than others, especially if you're in a group, you may be able to take more steps, or maybe might be able to take a more direct approach to intervening. And you might want to think about if there are any additional risk factors, like if there's a possibility if you would be arrested or so on and so forth. So like if there's a possibility for arrest, you might want to think, okay, about your immigration status. If you are on parole or probation, you might not want to have an interaction that could possibly to interact with police, so on or so forth. You might want to just look at what are your risk factors. But make sure you consider your privilege in these situations. So if you have more privilege and you're with other people who have less privilege, then it may be your duty to kind of step up more in that situation, and let them take a more supportive role based on their privilege status. Do what you can. This is like a little comedic thing. And because I think a lot of times people think that they can't do anything, or especially if you're like new to bystander intervention, you can sometimes get so frazzled or overwhelmed just at the prospect of trying to intervene that you kind of just stop or you freeze. But the reality of it is like, don't beat yourself up or stress yourself out about what you can or can't do. The the idea is just to think that there's always something that you can do. And sometimes that's just observing the situation. And sometimes it's less than that. Okay, so yeah, there's almost always something you can try. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. So that's kind of what I was saying here. You have a powerful influence as a bystander. And a lot of times that's just sometimes just observing can make someone change their actions. And a lot of times we see this when we're doing bystander intervention, when it comes to police interactions, is that someone's sometimes just standing there and watching them, or standing there and recording, or just even if you don't want to directly document or something like that, just even asking the person if they're okay, or if it's a child or someone that's young. A lot of times what I just do, like, what's your mom's number? And that completely changes like the tune of what they're doing, because they realize that, you know, there are other people who are watching them and also care about what's happening. So, you know, you stop and you kind of observe what's happening in the situation, you think, and then you act. You always have some options. Okay, so these are the 5 Ds of intervention. There are different ways that you can intervene in a situation. You can intervene directly, you can distract, you can delegate, delay, or document. And I'm gonna go through these. Okay, so, okay, we're good. All right, so this is scenario says you are at a restaurant and you see a woman at the bar being approached by a man she doesn't seem to know. He immediately stands very close to her and again begins putting his hand on her leg. The woman is visibly uncomfortable, but the man will not go away. No one around them seems to notice or do anything. Giving your barriers, what are you most likely to do? And I always say giving your barriers because you have to, like, again, always be checking your privilege and thinking about whatever risk factors you may have. And in this situation, you might be thinking about your own gender, size, just your own vulnerability in that situation. And so you may choose that you want to just distract the person. So you can pretend to be to the woman's friend and say that you need her to come with you. That could work. And someone who is a woman might not choose to do this, who might not choose to like directly go up to the guy and ask him what he's doing. So everybody's level of comfort kind of varies, which is why we said there's different ways to interact. Or you can choose to go up to the woman and tell her you want to talk to her in private. And lastly, you can delegate, because sometimes there's people who are more able and probably are more experienced in handling situations like this. So you can tell the bartender like what you witnessed and suggest that they intervene or keep an eye on the person. And I've done this before, and sometimes they will get security and like throw the person out. And so sometimes it really is that simple as just, you know, delegating the responsibility to someone else. Because a lot of, especially when you're in situations like this, they are pretty versed on like what to do and how to move forward. Okay. Let's see if we fly through this. All right, so this is just more examples in terms of how you can intervene. So you're leaving work, you see your coworker's ex waiting outside. You know already the situation that your coworker does not want to speak to the ex. So you can ask them what's going on. You can also tell her and ask her if she wants to talk to someone. And again, delegate. You can tell your supervisor, HR, or security to talk to the man. In some cases, like I've even seen like say, you know what, I'm gonna walk with you to your car instead. So just make sure that sometimes it's just more safety in numbers. And sometimes you can talk to some of my friends about confronting the behavior. There's always different ways that you can intervene. There's always something that you can do in the situation. And sometimes it just takes putting your head together with someone else just to figure out how do you intervene. Okay. And again, I'll share this slideshow. I just want to make sure that I get through all of this and get some questions. Okay, so one of the D's is document. And it's really important to take a video, especially if you're dealing with a situation where you think that the person, like with assault, where the person might want to press charges, or they might need documentation about what happened for a like another word for like a protective order or something like that. So a lot of times in those cases, you need documentation that that really happened. So taking a video is really helpful. This slide is like particularly when we're talking about police, because a lot of times people get really afraid when they're dealing with police, even though they see something that's wrong, that they're not sure exactly what they could do, but a lot of times just documenting and just saying what's happening in the situation can really like make a huge difference in like what's happening. And I think the big thing I always try to mention on this one, a lot of times people think that it's illegal to film the police. I don't know where that idea really came from, but it's not illegal to film the police. I think it's a fear tactic they use and say that you're interfering with a police investigation. But you have the right to film the police. They are public servants. So you can film them, you can record officers' names, their badges, license plates, and all of that is within your rights. If they tell you back up, please do back up. And a lot of times what I say is just like, take one step back and you can play that kind of backup game for as long as you want and, do that.
I would also just add here to always make sure that you get the video into the hands of the person who was harmed. They should always be, their own advocate in terms of how they want the footage to be used. If it gets put online, yeah.
Right, and that is a good point. Sometimes they do take and destroy your phone while you're recording. This has happened a lot of times, which is why sometimes we say multiple people record, and people record from different distances because sometimes they can't get everyone. That's the whole thing. So if there's multiple people there, multiple people should be recording. And what we've seen has been like the most effective, I think, if some people are recording and some people are actually engaging with the police, whoever feels that they have more privilege or they just feel more safe doing so, is that if someone's distracting the police and keeping them kind of busy, talking to them, asking what's going on, saying that I'm going to, I'm calling the person's parents and talking to the person that's actually being arrested, then they're too busy, dealing with the people who are distracting them to actually smash people's phones and so on and so forth. But that does happen a lot. And I think I say that in here. Yeah, if multiple bystanders have one person film and the others engage with the police or the person who has harmed the other person. And always, state your concerns. You're hurting them, they're a child, so on and so forth. And a lot of times, especially with dealing with cops, we ask them directly, like, why are they being arrested? What the problem is? And you say, I'm watching, I'm recording this, and you say exactly what is happening throughout the whole thing. Like, 3 cops just threw her to the ground, so on and so forth. And it makes them look bad, but it also, makes them very aware of like what they're doing and that it's wrong. Okay. Determine. If you're able, make sure you communicate directly with the person who's being harassed or harmed to determine the extent of the situation. So you ask them if they're okay, if they need help, and you stay with them if you can. You ask them if there's someone that you can call for them. If it's police interactions, you ask them if you let them know they don't have to consent to a search. They don't have to have their vehicle searched, so on and so forth. That they don't have to talk to the cops. A lot of times that's what people get caught up in, that part, like think that they have to consent to a search of their vehicle. The law enforcement has to have probable cause to search your vehicle. And in terms of like even documenting like a reasonable distance, in New York, it's like 30 feet. Okay, so if you think 30 feet, it's hard. Like a school bus is like 36 feet. So if you're 30 feet back, then you are not interfering with a police investigation. That's another thing I forgot to mention. Okay. Okay, so again, we said a lot about the rates of, especially just, Black trans women, trans folks in general, being assaulted and, being murdered. The homicide rates are increasing. And so we thought it was prudent to just include some tips to help assault survivors. And this is, relevant for people who are experiencing DV or any of that. You let them know you believe them, that you're here, that they're safe now. A lot of times you're kind of stuck in that flight response, or you freeze. And it's just important to kind of bring them back to reality and help them be centered. Let them know they did not deserve it and that you are sorry that it happened to them. You offer your support and you help them find resources, especially if you do know them. There's a crime victims assistance center in like every county, and they offer free services to help folks who have been victims of crimes, including like short-term counseling and things like that. For LGBTQ folks, I always say it's really important to find an affirming therapist. A lot of times when things like this happen, or even if they just, are in a family where they're not being affirmed and so on and so forth, it can be really important to have an affirming therapist, and they are out there. But a lot of times if you, have been a victim of assault or just haven't experienced trauma, it can be very difficult to kind of weed through resources. So if you can assist them with that part, that's always very helpful. And if you know them, please continue to check on them, because a lot of times most times it doesn't hit you when it happens. And it's later on when, things kind of start to sink in and you actually need that support after. Okay. Be proactive. We can take small actions every day to create a community that doesn't tolerate violence. Violence has become like so normalized in our society. We're like desensitized to it. We see it on TV. We play video games that from a very young age where it's just violence. And, I think a lot of people are even like desensitized to, police brutality and just, domestic violence. It's just so commonplace. And we don't call it out that we do tolerate violence just by our silence. And we have to realize that if you're silent, you are complicit. Okay, we can change the norm of violence. Educate yourself on power-based violence. A lot of times we don't think about that, but a lot of time, most often violence comes from a place of power. Examine our cultural reactions to various crimes and oppressions. I think a lot of times I'm talking to people of color. I think, I mentioned, we all have like, and I think this goes beyond just people of color, but I think most often we talk about, we all have like the creepy uncle and stuff like that. Everybody knows about him, you stay away from him and so on. And it's just something that's known, that's not said, but that should not be the case. The creepy uncle should not be invited to your house. The creepy uncle should not be allowed to sit at the Thanksgiving dinner table like everything is normal. That is not okay. And we are not accepting that. We are not tolerating that kind of behavior anymore. Learn about resources in your community. That's very important because resources do vary from community to community. And if you know your resources, then you're going to be more willing to like intervene and also help somebody because you already have the information. And take proactive actions. And a lot of times people are like, okay, but I don't know how to be proactive. So here you go. You just sat through a training that was about an hour and a half. We're almost through, almost 2 hours. So you spread the knowledge that you've learned about these issues. Start a conversation about victim blaming with a family member or friend, because we do a lot of victim blaming throughout society. It's kind of just been normalized and we don't even realize that we're doing it. There's still lots of conversations when women are raped or assaulted about like what she was wearing, if she drank too much, why didn't she have a buddy? Like that's all victim blaming. We shouldn't do it, but it still happens. And even like with the Me Too movement, people have kind of made it like a joke and a lot of like negative banter about it. And I've seen this a lot of times in the workplace, you know, men joke about, oh, I can't get too close to you because I don't want to, you know, I don't want to end up in HR because, you know, Me Too and all of that kind of stuff. So we shut down those kind of things when people make comments like that. Ask a friend how violence affected them, because sometimes we don't have our own, or we might even have our own personal stories. We don't realize that violence is pretty widespread. And even if you personally don't have a story about how violence affected you personally, you probably know someone that had that violence affected them deeply. Encourage 5 people to learn more about these issues and intervention options. Like I said, we just mentioned a few here and ran through some different scenarios, but there are a myriad of different scenarios and different ways in which you can intervene. And this, you know, barely scratches the surface of it. Share social media about violence prevention and bystander intervention. I said this already. Shut down offensive jokes when you hear them and make it known that violence will not be tolerated in your spheres. And I say it all as violence, because I think a lot of times we don't think about like jokes as being violent, but these are all like, they all perpetuate harm and they are all violent. So make sure that you don't just think about, you know, someone physically hitting someone or like assaulting someone as violence. There are a lot of different ways to harm someone, and it is all violent. Volunteer for a cause or create an awareness event. A lot of times we can just do that, and it's really important because that just more people that know about it and have an understanding about what bystander intervention is, or just about domestic violence, or whatever the cause is that you're passionate about, then we can do something about it. Because I think everybody knows it's like a multiplicative effect. You know, one person tells another person, that person tells 2 more people, and next thing you know, we have 100 people who are trained and actually have been doing bystander intervention. And then pay reparations. That just, I always have to say that one. Okay. LGBTQ resources. So there are a lot of different resources out there, but I always like to mention these few. So GLAD is a major organization that offers all kinds of different things. You can also find like just information to educate yourself. So that's a good one to know on. The Trevor Project is specifically for LGBTQ youth. So that means anyone under 25. And then the Safe Zone Project, I say that one because it exists a lot on college campuses. A lot of people get Safe Zone trained, but I always say the Safe Zone training, I've been through it myself, it's very surface level. So don't just think that like you can slap a sticker on like your office door, office window, and then that means you're safe and you've done your due diligence. You know, you have to be continually unpacking your privileges and like just learning. Like I said, like language changes and just things change. And you have to make sure you're continuously doing your due diligence to actually, you know, create responsible spaces for your students and the people that you know. Okay, so there's just more resources. Like the Trevor Project does have, it has a text line you can call, and they also do have like a web chat as well. Trans Lifeline is actually a peer support service. So all of the people who run that, who answer that lifeline are trans. So I think that's always important to mention. And LGBTQ National Helpline and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Those are all good ones to know. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is for anyone. Anyone can use that one. And that one is also, these are all 24/7, 365. Okay, we did it. Questions, comments? No, we threw a lot of information at you folks.
So a lot of people are thanking you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Primarily. And then, I mean, if there's any questions or any tidbits, anything else that you'd like to contribute, this would be the time. You can feel free to raise your hand or add it to the chat.
Good. Okay, I'm glad that everyone enjoyed a lot of information. I'm glad that it was informative for folks. And again, I will send it to Tiffany, just in case people want to, look at it again, or you want to share it with other people who maybe weren't able to attend.
Yeah, so we'll be sharing out the recordings from last week and tonight's presentation, along with any other resources or information you email me, Chanel. I'll include that.
And you'll see a lot of them. There are links in the presentation, so you can just click on a lot of stuff. Monique, you have your hand up.
I do have a question, Chanel, but I would prefer that it not be recorded. Is that okay?
Did we stop the recording? I think